A man with conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. Leon Festinger. Are we witnessing a doubling down and cultish behavior over the pandemic response? This is the subject of tonight's broadcast. Now, I appreciate tonight's title and graphic is somewhat more triggering than our usual style. However, despite much of the world opening up and rolling back restrictions, we are still receiving news from staunch supporters of lockdowns and pharmaceutical interventions that we should be more and more worried and concerned now and into the future, as if there is no end point. Could it be that some have vested interests in drawing out this farcical show? Tune in tonight to explore what's going on. Now, I think it's safe to say that the real crisis has died down this week. I'm speaking about the Will Smith and Chris Rock incident, where all of a sudden the whole world found profound meaning from a single incident at the Oscars. So I feel comfortable turning my attention back onto the pandemic. Now, I wouldn't normally make offhand jokes about this sort of thing in an episode, particularly where there's actually massive global conflict right now. But it is Friday, and if we don't laugh our way through life right now, then quite frankly, things are pretty darn depressing. A crisis of the pandemic, has it passed? Are we still amidst it? A global conflict, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of many different crises. You know, we have to smile through this, otherwise, quite frankly, we will just all get depressed. So doubling down, the cult of COVID, as many of us know, certainly in England, the United Kingdom, all but past most of the restrictions. Yes, there's still some niggling pieces left over, and this is now starting to be the trend around the world. But some are really clinging on to these old ways of being around restrictions and mandates and just trying to continually hype up the fear. Now, to bring some context to this, one of the most popular, in fact, the most popular episode that we've recorded on the Pandemic podcast with Professor Matthias Desmet, where we talked about mass formation. In fact, it was that episode that led to Dr. Robert Malone taking that content and really popularizing it through his interviews with the likes of Joe Rogan. But when Matthias spoke on the podcast, he talked about this crisis of meaning, this crisis of free-floating anxiety, and people were attaching, what he observed is that people were attaching their purpose really to this external threat in forming this solidarity to tackle the virus. Therefore, they got a real purpose and meaning from actually following the narrative, following the restrictions and the mandates, and taking great virtue in doing that. But we've also speculated and seen that many of the individuals, from MPs to politicians to anyone that's been actively involved in quote unquote managing the pandemic, the same potential outcome manifesting with those individuals, whereby, you know, they get to suppress the usual stresses and anxieties of their usual responsibilities as MPs, for instance, to really double down and tackle COVID-19 and solidarity to protect people, to protect the nation, you know, this noble gesture. And many, it seems, are not ready to quite let go of that, because it will mean confronting the brutal reality of their own existence once again, and probably a mounting set of responsibilities, given that for the last 2 years, pretty much everything has fallen by the wayside other than COVID-19. So a prospect that many, I feel, are fearing returning to, despite many of us willing on a move forward to freedom and normality again, a new normal of our own creation, I will add, not some engendered secretly covert plan for how our lives will unfold. Now, in conjunction with my slightly triggering title and speculating about the prospect of a new normal that's been conspired by institutions, I know will lead to some people saying that's all just conspiracy. But you can say that if you've got your eyes closed. But those of us who've got our eyes awake and just witnessing the trajectory that this world is on can quite clearly see that there are potential vested interests in maintaining the fear, maintaining the pandemic. We know from history, if we zoom out a little, we can see that crises like these, and indeed like the situation in Ukraine and Russia after it, will enable those in power to accumulate more power. It will accumulate those with money to accumulate more money. And it presents great opportunities. And there's the old phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. And we can be quite certain there are many parties, individuals, and organizations who have certainly not let the pandemic go to waste. And, you have to question those who are maintaining the desire to maintain the fear and the culture of restrictions and mandates. What is it really? What do they stand to gain? Either on a material propositional level in terms of financial gain, but also from that psychological angle that I spoke about. Many will have to be forced to confront the realities of their own life. The idea that within mass formation, that the free-floating anxiety within our own lives is masked by the fact that we suddenly have anxiety pinned to an external threat, such as a virus, means that we don't have to confront our own inner anxieties. Well, now that COVID is entered certainly into a different phase where it produces much less of a threat, and you could argue, looking back over the data, that really the threat was quite focused around a clear set of variables, all of which I really do hope will come out in the wash with the public inquiry, which we'll talk much more about later. But still now, I read some shocking stories of people around the world, particularly in countries that have followed kind of zero COVID strategies, which again, I'll touch upon later, such as China, Australia. In fact, the story I read was in particular relating to citizens in Australia who had become so accustomed to living under restrictions and mandates that they feared going back to their lives. They feared re-entering society. And now this is something that becomes a conditioned and learned behavior. It becomes almost a learned helplessness. And we certainly have witnessed this over the course of the pandemic. And indeed, reading about the situation in China, China was so aggressive in its pandemic response that they had to use some of the behavioral science that we've witnessed, sadly, in the United Kingdom to condition people into compliance and into aligning with the fear. China had to then reverse that to actually coerce people out of their homes in order to become productive again and within the economy. And it's no laughing matter because, quite frankly, there are literally thousands of people, if not millions out there, who probably will need some form of cognitive behavioral therapy or other forms of psychotherapy to actually help people transcend the challenges that they've been through. So this episode tonight is really focused on that kind of cult of COVID, this doubling down of behavior. Have we witnessed cultish behavior? Mass formation touches upon it in Desmond's work in the sense that you can take those four conditions that he spoke about, free-floating anxiety, a lack of meaning and purpose, social discontent, and the fourth one just eludes me at this moment in time. But these variables can be elicited and utilized in cult formation. And I am actually going to, I opened up tonight's episode with a quote from Leon Festinger because he, through his work, studied cult formation, and it actually led to the discovery or the definition of cognitive dissonance. And I'll explain that more in a moment. But just to give some wider context to this, I've spoken about how many of the obviously restrictions and mandates have rolled back generally around the world. There are countries still pursuing zero COVID, China being one of them. There are some other countries that have still got stringent measures in place, including things like vaccine passports and other forms of mandates and restrictions on social gatherings. And we often forget these things are still going on, particularly through our own lens, if we're here in the United Kingdom and most of these things are surpassed. But we still hear about the resurgence of the kind of subvariant of Omicron in the UK. There's still this like hammering of fear that we still need to pay attention. But despite the greater transmissibility of these newer variants, and to be quite frank, the fact that it seems like the scientific community is shocked about the fact that these are, or make a fuss about the fact that these are more transmissible, is quite confusing, because as just a citizen observer, I'm no scientist. I'm reasonably intelligent, and having spent 2 years studying this darn thing, I have a reasonable understanding of so many different facets of the scientific and empirical data, that you just look back through the history of coronaviruses and recognize these are just typical patterns. Of course, they become more transmissible. They become typically weaker over time. Yes, there's always exceptions to those things. You could point to different viruses that have behaved differently, but this one is following a very typical pattern. And the fact that even recently, in the discovery of the Deltacron, or whatever the Transformers virus was called, and that you can joke about it sound like a Transformers character, and if you don't know Transformers, you're probably too young to remember. Although the young people of this world don't seem to care that their freedoms have just been ransacked for the last 2 years. So the chances of a young person watching this and going, Transformers, what's that? Probably not going to happen, sadly. It seems like people of my generation and older who have a care for the future generations to come, who are out there in the battlefields trying to, in the proverbial trenches. And again, I'm very conscious of these types of language now in the context of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, but fighting through protest to actually defend freedoms and uphold and protect freedoms for ourselves and our younger generations to come. It just seems that the younger generation are absent from that conversation. But anyway, I digress. The Deltacron variant, there was this discovery, and the initial discovery mentioned it as a recombinant virus, which means that it's essentially where two variants of one virus have combined to form a new variant. There was this initial discovery, and then through the official science, it was all denied that it would be possible, that it can't possibly be recombinant. And then several weeks later, the science has changed now. Yes, it is a recombinant variant. And of course, if you just look at scientific history, entirely plausible, entirely likely. So you've just got to bang your head a little bit and go, what have we been going through the last 2 years? How did it get so insane? And why do some people want to cling on to that insanity? Really, do you have so little going on in your life that that's the only form of meaning? Well, the reality is it's quite clear that people have so little meaning in their lives. The fact that for the best part of this week, people's meaning has been gathered from Chris Rock and Will Smith and dissecting, what does it mean, for society, and was it the right thing to do? Is all of these things. People got such meaning from this entirely meaningless interaction, really. It shows, quite frankly, that we're screwed, and the crisis of meaning is perhaps the bigger crisis we need to tackle. The background free-floating anxiety, the social discontent, these roots of this type of behavior, this cultish mass formation behavior. We've got a long way to go to tackle the roots of that problem. But not only the roots of the problem, quite frankly, when we talk about the vested interests, well, the vested interests are there to keep you in that state because you become active consumers, you become very compliant, and it just leads to profitable outcomes for so many different entities. That, of course, the conditions of the systems, the operating systems of the world aren't favorable to reducing anxiety, to helping people find meaning and purpose, and to reducing background discontent. It's just, quite frankly, missing. But we do very much need to tackle the meaning crisis. But anyway, I've digressed twice now, so let's get refocused. So, despite the greater transmission of this subvariant of Omicron, it appears that there are no tangible concerns for hospitals. There's been a marginal uptick in patients with critical care beds in England the last week. Only 7. These are stats on Jamie Jenkins, who's been analysing this information. This is fresh from just yesterday. 7.7% of beds have patients with COVID, and 67.5% of patients don't have COVID, and 24.8% of beds are unoccupied. So that the old notion of protect the NHS is just far from a reasonable discussion here, other than the fact that we've absolutely decimated the NHS the last 2 years through the protocols, leaving record waiting lists, which are probably not even going to be resolved with my lifetime, quite frank. I'm intending to live a pretty long life, but perhaps we've screwed things up so royally that we need to look at different healthcare systems altogether. Perhaps we do. That's certainly where my thinking is at. Anyway, the other piece of key information that most people seem to gloss over is that 60% or plus of patients in beds with COVID are primarily in hospital for other reasons. It means it's just a test. There's no clinical factors that say that they need to be in hospital for COVID. They just happen to have tested positive, which we know through the PCR. You could have got a fragment of the viral material in your body from the last 60, 90 days, even longer, and you're testing positive. That's the lunacy of the situation we find ourselves in. So we're not seeing any tangible concerns in the UK. And of course, in the scope of what's possible, it is still possible that things could go south, of course, and we would keep our minds open to what could happen. But the reality is the situation seems to be on a global level generally improving, and people are getting on with their lives. They're resuming activity, which is a real positive thing, not only for all the key pillars of society, education, healthcare, the economy, but also for people's mental well-being, their general joy to vive, their wellness, their life satisfaction. It provides the opportunity that we might find purpose from something else again. But still, these staunch supporters of lockdown and pharmaceutical interventions just cannot let go. But surely now we have much more worrisome things to think about. Yes, the situation in Ukraine and Russia, quite frankly, the way things are playing out globally, it's, as I've talked about in the podcast before, like China is wrestling with the West and US and NATO. It's almost like the press are willing this thing to get worse as they did with COVID. That's truly worrisome. But also on the practical side, for people getting on with their lives right now, rocketing costs of living, inflation, energy prices going through the roof. People have got real stuff they need to actually deal with now because COVID kind of masked that hole in the floor called the economy. There's like this carpet over this gaping hole that now the carpet is off and things are starting to collapse. So it's really important that we actually get context and get back focused on what's really important. But let's look at some of these examples of doubling down. And there are so many right now that actually I've just had to be, thanks to my team, just very selective about what I actually talk about, because it's just, just scroll Twitter for a while. Just scroll Twitter for a while. The people who've been doommongers throughout just can't let go of being doommongers. It's become part of who they are. It's an identity level shift. And it won't just be an identity level shift for COVID. They're scaremongering, they're doommongering. The way they operate has become so intrinsically involved in their psyche that it's likely that everything now will go through the same lenses for those individuals. The same is true, though, however, looking at the flip side, and it's true of mass formation as well, the same will also happen from the skeptic community. Those who have become deeply skeptical will now probably approach everything with the same skepticism, which will lead to similar problems, quite frankly. It's very healthy to have healthy skepticism, but if you take that to the nth degree and become skeptical about everything, that's also problematic. We just need to become more consciously aware. Anyway, digression again. So let's review some examples of doubling down. Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance yesterday. COVID scaremongering returns. So Patrick Vallance says new variant may take world by storm. Chris Whitty warns the NHS is still under huge pressure. Well, hang on a minute. Didn't I just share the data to show really it's not? 24.8% beds unoccupied in the critical care sector. Yes, it's under pressure thanks to your policies, dear scientific advisors, sage experts. The NHS is very much under huge pressure thanks to the lifelong waiting list that you've created. And Jenny Harries dear bless her, calls for Brits to keep wearing face masks because COVID infections are so high. And just show me some empirical evidence that shows how wearing masks in any country or comparable country or territory has had a significant positive impact on COVID cases. Good luck. Now, speaking at the virtual Royal Society conference, because, don't get in a room together, you might get a cold. Sir Patrick said the pandemic is not over and noted we've got very high infection rates at the moment. Well, yes, we do have high infection rates. But when are we going to reach? Who decides when the pandemic is over? What definition are we actually using for the pandemic now that we can all agree upon? I don't think we actually any longer have a shared ideal of what a pandemic actually represents. And we know that the WHO changed the definition. But I continue that Patrick Vallance said the room for this virus to evolve remains very high. So we could be taken by surprise again with a variant that escapes immunity. Well, unfortunately, for those who are relying on vaccine-based immunity, there is a high probability that could be the case. Now, those of us who have been infected naturally and likely got sustainable B and T cell responses, which is so far proving to be evident for most of the new variants, with the data still emerging, that reality could take some by surprise. But the good fortune is, as we've talked about already, that generally coronaviruses, as they evolve, will become less harmful, even if they become more virulent, more transmissible, rather. And Vallance goes on to say that there'll be future pandemics, which looks very different to the current one. Well, you would expect so, unless you're just, unless it's just a little production line of pandemics, the next one in the waiting. Well, let's just put another one out just like the other one. We know what to do now. No, it doesn't really work like that, does it? Or maybe it does. Who knows? The virus leak from China. Maybe it's just, maybe there's much more to this than we yet know. But we do need to keep our eyes open on that one. Now, Dr. Christina Pagel, director of the UCL's Clinical Operational Research Unit, is one of those individuals that has clung on to. If you follow her on Twitter, if you want to be triggered daily, go and watch her Twitter. Her unit applies advanced analytical methods to problems in healthcare, which you would have thought gives you a really solid grounding to understand risk. But constantly, the fear mongering that's come from her is being, quite frankly, unacceptable. But again, she's trapped now. She can't escape her fear mongering. It's become identity level for her. Maybe it already was prior to the pandemic. It just played it out. I don't know. Maybe I should invite her to be on the show. We can have a psychoanalysis situation. Maybe tag us. I may have come across as unfriendly. I try not to judge people, although I clearly have just judged you. I'm very, very sorry. We're all one team humanity. We're all trying to do the best with what we know. But I have to point out that the quote from the 30th March, the pandemic has changed. The idea that it's over is false. Omicron represents a major variant, taking the UK in a similar way to Delta last summer and Alpha last winter. The ubiquitous narrative that the pandemic is over exists because most people, including the government, now believe at least one of three big myths of the Omicron age. And she goes on to talk about all these different myths about Omicron, and even challenging the fact that it's not as severe. And it's just like, well, hang on a minute. The empirical evidence suggests that it is less severe. And it did so very early from the initial data out of South Africa. Anyway, I continue. Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland extending mask wearing until April the 18th. And she's failed to compare the outcomes of England and Scotland all along. It's just ludicrous. And there's other nations and areas still calling for more mask wearing and in schools. When does it end? And when do we actually properly look at the evidence that's created by any entity that has nothing to gain from producing evidence? The calls for more boosters. We did an episode last week on, or is it this week? I've lost track. The fourth dose. That was this week, calling for more boosters, despite the fact that at this point we're all aware that the vaccines do not significantly reduce transmission, and that given the vast majority of those in hospitals have been jabbed. The figures are astronomical now. The idea that it's effective at this point is highly questionable. Yet we still hear new stories about the fourth dose, the fifth dose, much of which uh, has contributed to the national debts that we're now grappling with. That's not to mention the billions spent, the 300 plus billion that the UK has spent on the pandemic response, full stop. And yet here we are hearing stories of people struggling to heat and eat. My goodness. When will those people turn and look at their government and say, you shouldn't have spent all that money, because they shouldn't have? And hopefully the public inquiry will find that. We'll give it a best shot. So you can tell I'm on a bit of a rant this Friday afternoon. And then China. Let's get to China. Zero COVID strategy. China locks down a city, Shanghai, of 9 million people for 4,000 cases of Omicron. 9 million people slammed back into lockdown. You know, this is really not letting go of the idea of zero COVID. You know, this idea that you can completely prevent transmission. What's your exit strategy if you follow that route? It's just unbelievable. Now, what's going on? I've already touched upon it. Some will likely have vested interests. Let's think about this. You know, the vaccine passports came along. Obviously, the pharmaceutical industrial complex is just trying to squeeze the juice out of this thing, and they will continue to do so. And every new variant is a new opportunity for a new buck. But, you know, most people are still, you know, blind to it all, wearing their face mask over their eyes. But we've just got to help them see. You know, perhaps my style of broadcast tonight, maybe my slightly jovial, whimsical style will find its way to some people. I know for others, they'll find this is repulsive, the fact that I've talked in this way about very serious situation. But between us, we'll find a way to get people to open their eyes and start looking at what's been going on. We know that certain corporations and certain individuals have vastly gained from the pandemic. That's clearly been documented. It's very evident. It's no longer a conspiracy. But also history shows that it's not a conspiracy. We know that organizations will profit from these situations. And the, you know, the frameworks that have now been outlined, you know, have become a pretext for many more profitable endeavors. You know, the vaccine passports, everyone speculated would be a precursor to digital IDs, whether that's digital health IDs. You know, we're still seeing the vaccine passports, and it's fascinating. What's fascinating is the travel alliances, the travel companies are saying we don't need these things anymore. We're trying to let go. Yet, of course, there's a wrestle. But again, the travel companies, of course, don't want them because they want to increase their revenues, quite rightly, from all the missed trade over the last 2 years, thanks to all the different things. But either way, you've got profit versus profit fighting it out. It's market forces now. But you've got those who want to keep it because it lays the foundation for digital IDs. Case in point, on April the 6th in the United Kingdom, a new digital identity document verification technology called IDVT that enables data sharing between public bodies and businesses for the purpose of identity verification will be introduced in the UK, paving the way. But lots of things are paving the way. We saw unique uses of CRISPR gene editing technology during the course of the pandemic. These things would never have happened. These things would never have been approved, or highly likely to be approved under normal circumstances. We're seeing things passing through that would never pass through, whether that's legislation or approvals. You know, leaps in profits from organizations that have cashed in on the situation. It's been unprecedented, and I'm tired of hearing that word unprecedented, but quite frankly, unprecedented. Moreover, you know, we've got this situation, you know, the testing manufacturers, you know, good luck to them now. The government is going to stop purchasing these things. And that was my boy just walking in and saying, "Dada, hello." Well, he didn't walk in. He's not quite walking yet. He's trying his best. 7 months old. But we all know that these corporations have vastly gained from the pandemic, whether it's testing, vaccines, IDs, various other different mechanisms. But of course, it's still in their incentive to proliferate and extend the pandemic for as long as possible. So how are they trying to keep people in the belief that these things must go on? To help explain this, I'm going to return to that original quote from Leon Festinger to understand the psychology of believers and how this doubling down on a bad idea plays out in people. And this, to help illustrate this, and this is really the crux of tonight's episode, there was a story from 1957 about a doomsday cult and what happened when their prophecy did not come to be. Now, this ended up becoming a participant study, where psychologists studied this cult. The cult believed that the earth was going to be destroyed by a flood. And it looked at what happened to its members, particularly the really committed ones who had given up their homes and their jobs to work and join the cult, and to see what happened when the flood eventually did not happen. And of course, it didn't happen because we're still here. Now, the story is quite bizarre, but there was this individual who started the cult who claimed to have received messages from the Guardians, a group of people from a superior beings from another planet, who said that the flood would be spreading to form an island sea stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico and would destroy the world on the 21st of December 1954. So a number of psychologists joined this group, and they observed firsthand months of this behavior in advance of the supposed apocalypse, but they observed months after the supposed apocalypse and witnessed how people behaved. And what they recognized was, whilst the more fringe members were more inclined to put it down to experience, they made fools of themselves, they'd been tricked. Here we are on April Fool's Day, fools indeed. But the committed members, those who are most committed to the cult, most committed to the behaviors, the beliefs, the values of the cult and the ideas, were more likely to continue to reinterpret the evidence to show that they were right all along, and that the earth was not destroyed because of their faithfulness to the cult. Their belief was that their actions alone saved the earth, and that you can see how people's psychology could fall into that trap, that they would believe that it was their doing. They saved the world through being part of this cult. But this discovery, where they rather than abandoning their discredited beliefs, the group members adhered to them even more strongly. They actually begin then, doubling down, the subject of today's video. And isn't it interesting how we can witness that kind of cultish behavior now with COVID? That this prophet, this fear mongering, this hypersensitive discussion of how COVID is going to, these proclaimments of the impact these variants are going to have. It's just become a force of habit for these individuals, but they cannot let go. And again, to be quite frank, the same is happening on the other side, the skeptic side. Of course, there are certain beliefs that other people won't let go of. But the point is here, this behavior has been playing out significantly during COVID-19. Now, this particular study of the cult, it actually led to the concept of cognitive dissonance, which cognitive dissonance, if you're not familiar, refers to a situation involving conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So in the instance of this cult, they predicted this doomsday flood that would end the planet, and the fact that it didn't means that they're wrestling with the fact that they believed that it would, but then it didn't. So they got two contradictory pieces of information. It creates inner mental discomfort, leading to alterations in their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors in order to reduce their own mental discomfort. So people live in this dissonance in order to feel more comfortable inside. So this is why we could argue that the dissonance is still playing out here, that people want to hold on to the pre-existing beliefs that they've developed over the last 2 years. And despite changing evidence, will continue to double down on their own evidence, cherry picking data to support their claims. Now, again, this, of course, can happen on the skeptic side as well. And what we actually really need to do through the public inquiry is enter to a point of synthesis where we're actually able to get out of the hysteria, break through those paradigms, and look at a blank page and say, let's actually evaluate what happened. Dunning-Kruger's curve can come out here. If you're not familiar with that, everyone thinks they're an expert all of a sudden. You could say that about me early on. Got all this information. But actually you end up recognizing it's complex, and it is complex. But there are certain patterns that have been evident right since the beginning that have just been suppressed and ignored, that we cannot ignore any longer, particularly as we go into this public inquiry phase. And it's clear to see that some who supported strong lockdowns, vaccine mandates, may undergo now this form of cognitive dissonance if they were when they confront that their sacrifices may have been for ill-conceived policies. That's going to put them really in that dissonance, because the flood didn't come. It's fundamentally damaging to people on many levels, but they may not be willing to confront the fact that they subscribe to these and complied with these things. And remember back to the walking for an hour a day, running for an hour a day. You could run 100 times a day and still come into contact with no one, and it wouldn't make a difference. But people are just locked into those prior beliefs that have been ingrained so deeply through enforcement. But therefore it becomes almost necessary to literally keep the cult alive by continuing to find reasons to support why these steps were necessary. And the public inquiry, in its many ways, if you look at the way it's pre-framed, they're talking about, should we have locked down earlier, longer, harder? We need to speak to the bereaved. And of course you need to speak to the bereaved. But if you only look through the lens of the bereaved, they're only going to tell one side of the story. You have to talk to everyone who's been affected by the pandemic, including those who have lost their livelihoods, lost their mental well-being, lost loved ones without being able to say goodbye, missed their grandchildren growing up. These are real effects that we cannot ignore. The hospital waiting list, the missed education, the giant hole in the economy, the giant hole in our well-being. You can't ignore these things, but there will be people out there trying to find reasons to support why we should have done more, longer, harder, faster lockdowns, despite all of the contrary evidence that's now available. So we must stop and recognize the techniques being used to keep us in this state of cultish belief about the pandemic policies. We must stop others from clouding our judgment in the run-up to the public inquiry over the pandemic response for the reasons I've outlined. We really need to take stock of what we got right, and more so what we got wrong. It's more important to assess what we didn't do rather than what we did do. The other way around. We need to what we did do rather than what we didn't do. Meaning that if we keep asking the question, what if we locked down earlier? What if we locked down harder? We're missing the questions around what did we do and the consequence of those actions that we did take. The damages we're only starting to see now. That's the reality. We will continue to see the unfolding of the harms over the years to come, maybe decades to come, economically, politically. The loss of trust in institutions, the loss of trust in media, the loss of the hole in the economy, the hole in the massive hospital waiting list, the dent on people's educations. We just don't know how this is going to create a ripple effect, but we're already seeing significant damage. So we need to ensure that we put pressure on the government to hear our voices and acknowledge all of the damages from the pandemic response, and for the pandemic response to be scrutinized thoroughly, holistically, and with all honesty. So, on that point, to end and conclude tonight's episode, next week our focus and the build-up to the public inquiry consultation closure date, which is on Thursday, the 7th of April at midnight or close to midnight, we're going to be focusing on the public inquiry. So we're going to be talking about this public inquiry in more depth. Next week on Tuesday, we've got an episode about the public inquiry. Again, we've already recorded a specific episode on that. I'll put the link in the comments. But we're also going to provide a template that you can use to actually ensure that we have an appropriate terms of reference. Now, there are some templates out there already circulating around, and some of them are better than others. But we're working with a group under the notion of a pandemic reform committee. It's an international group. We're hoping to get together a public inquiry framework, a set of frameworks that we can use internationally. Other countries can use these frameworks. And we'll be putting this forward next week as part of our work, as part of our episodes. And I hope to bring you a couple of interviews as well, at least one interview supporting the public inquiry. But again, our work here just begins. We've done over 500 episodes over the last 2 years, really examining things. But it's time that we really do now question everything. So it's our plan going into Q2. We haven't finalized the details yet, but we want to run our own public inquiry series. We'd like to involve you, the public, in that. But it's important that we start to actually ask the bigger questions in the wake of what's happened in the last couple of years. And I know, many of you are probably tired of watching the pandemic podcast and hearing all of the doom and gloom about what's been going on. But it's now time that we go the final few miles. I've shared this story before on the podcast, but I ran the Athens Marathon in 2015, 26 miles, the first 21 miles uphill slog in the super hot weather of Athens, of Greek summer. And I got to mile 21 and I was ready to let go and just give up. But the reality was I trained all year. I hadn't come that far to give up. So, of course, I pushed on, got to the finish line, completed the job. The same is now true of the pandemic. We're on mile 21. We've come a long way, 2 years in, but now we've got to walk or run or attempt to run, maybe walk, the final 5 miles, which is doing the hard work to ensure that in the wake of COVID-19, we see appropriate evaluation, accountability, and reform. And it's down to us to help move that along. So if you want to be part of that journey, then please, if you haven't already, share this episode because we need more people to help us with this process. But importantly, please join our mailing list. Please join our mailing list. And even if you've unsubscribed because you want to get on with your life, rejoin. Go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. That's Dan J. Gregory, as in Michael J. Fox. Dan J. Gregory, middle name J. danjgregory.com/pandemic. Join our mailing list. We'll keep you up to date with our content. But more importantly, we'll share the public inquiry template with you next week once we've got it finalized. So please join the mailing list. We are shortly about to reformat the show. We will continue the conversation on the pandemic in the wake of this as part of our public inquiry series, as part of the reform series. But we are now looking at the more systemic issues. We're looking at how we can not only resist some of the changes that are happening in the world and sort of tackle the trajectory that the world is on, but start to really rebuild and reimagine the future we want to create. So we're launching a podcast called the Elevate Podcast. It's about how do we elevate humanity? How do we elevate ourselves? How do we transcend our consciousness? And also, how do we elevate the world? How do we create societal transformation? How do we create the political systems, the economic, healthcare systems of the future, the education systems of the future? How do we transform those societal systems for the better of humanity and the world we live in? So watch this space. You'll be the first to hear about that. And if you want to join our Elevate community, you can do that right now at weareelevate.org. That's weareelevate.org. And you can join our existing community there. So it's important that we keep this work up. So again, 2 calls to action for you, or 3 calls to action for you. Number 1, hit the share button, please. Our numbers of viewers have dropped significantly since the heat of the pandemic is over. As I mentioned, we've got to tackle this last 5 miles. So please do share the podcast. Please do subscribe if you haven't done so already at danjgregory.com/pandemic. And if you want to join our Elevate Network community, you can join as a member for free at weareelevate.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll be back next week for our public inquiry series as we march towards the closure of the public inquiry consultation on the 7th of April in the UK. Thanks again. I will see you next week. Have a